For Comedy Hype News, I'm Tamika. Many syndicated sketch comedy shows have had their time in the sun, from Fox's Mad TV and In Living Color to Chappelle's Show and Key and Peele. They help us laugh and find light in what can sometimes be a dark world. But one sketch comedy show, The Sketch Comedy Show, has stood the test of time and is quickly approaching what will be its 50th year on air, Saturday Night Live. At this junction, SNL has entered a more mature, structured, and defined period of its life. But in that extremely long runtime, SNL has had its shares of highs and lows, ups and downs, and ebbs and flows. The show has rotated its cast more times than you could probably comprehend and prides itself on keeping a fresh, new ensemble. The catch is, when rotating cast members so often and after being on air for such a long time, there are bound to be a few bad seasons and even worse relationships. This was the state of the show during comedy legend Adam Sandler's 94 through 95 tenure, when an unfortunate combination of bad seasons and bad relationships led to his termination and departure from the show. Sandler debuted on SNL in 1990, and the rest is history, right? Well, not quite. The NC complex, fast-talking juror from Uncut Gems is far from the immature boy whose co-star Janine Garofalo described at the time as childish. Back then, Sandler worked under showrunner Lorne Michaels. Under Michaels, a culture of fratty and immature behavior was allowed to thrive. Chris Smith, author of the New York Magazine article Comedy Isn't Funny, spent a week on the set of the struggling sketch comedy show. Many instances of this toxic workplace behavior are detailed in this article, such as favoritism, sexism, and racism. In a white male-dominated space, there was very little room for valid criticism of bigotry. For example, Smith writes, as the cast prepared for its first show of the season hosted by Steve Martin, Garofalo made the mistake of objecting to a sketch as sexist. That brought down the wrath of Fred Wolf, who had written the piece. Another notable instance is an interaction between senior SNL writer Jim Downey and the late Chris Farley. Sandler and Farley were making prank calls in the writer's room, Sandler pretending to be an old woman, and afterwards Farley making a much more juvenile effort at a prank call. Farley picks up the phone, asks the unfortunate soul on the other side if he hears thunder, and proceeds to hold the receiver to his butt and farts. The writers laugh louder than they have all night, except Downey, who's slowly wagging his head, says Smith in his article. After being publicly shamed by Downey, who brought up an allegation of sexual harassment against Farley, the fun was over. According to Smith, Farley finally says with a shrug, "Come on, let's all take a break and go down to the village. Me and Adsy and Sandler are gonna go chatting around." None of the writers move. Farley and Sandler strut out the room. But Sandler is no stranger to a rowdy bunch. Back in '87, he did a 4-episode stint on The Cosby Show and brought friend and fellow comedian Chris Rock with him to the taping. Rock hung around the set enamored with Cosby, and when the warm-up comedian felt sick, Rock took his place for a brief moment and had the audience cracking up. Unfortunately, he made an unflattering comment about Bill Cosby's Fat Albert show, joking, "And what's with Bill's Cosby mushmouth, the most racist character?" This struck a nerve with Cosby and led to Sandler's close friend being kicked off the set by Cosby. Beyond the infantile behavior, there were certain unspoken rules to abide by when employed at SNL. For instance, when Garofalo described Sandler's work at SNL as childish, she faced retaliation. Upon her return to the studio, Sandler flat out refused to speak to Garofalo, giving her the cold shoulder for weeks, and when he finally did, it was only to criticize her. However, to Garofalo's credit, Sandler once said in an interview with the LA Times, "One time I did a shaky lip guy on the Halloween show, and then I did Canteen Boy, and in the middle of Canteen Boy, I started shaking my lip. Everyone was looking at me like, what are you doing? Canteen Boy doesn't shake his lip." The limited pool of characters, their accents, and mannerisms lend themselves to the Sandler that America is most familiar with, and while this worked for him in movies, it simply wasn't the type of dynamic energy and range necessary for sketch comedy. Combine this perceived lack of range with a cast of 13, not including the writers, it's easy to see how Sandler's antics could have caused a fuss. Chemistry in an ensemble that large is hard to maintain, and while Sandler may have received some laughs, the general consensus was that he didn't know when enough was enough. For example, in an attempt to diffuse some tension and cure some boredom on set, Sandler sings in his trademark idiot boy voice, but his humor sometimes persisted past the point that it was welcome. At first, there were a few laughs. When Sandler continues into the third verse of the Carpenter song and then the fourth, people start inspecting their shoelaces, Smith recounts. Another time, after Sandler name-dropped Steven Spielberg on the previous week's episode in a funny song, As you can tell, Sandler had a knack for musical comedy. The director called to sing praises to the young SNL star. Smith speculates that Sandler must have viewed this as an opportunity to capitalize, as he then held up a Thursday rehearsal to use the facilities to wish Spielberg a happy birthday. During this time, Sandler was only hurting himself. A Looper article reported reviews were dire, and the show's weekly budget had ballooned to an all-time high of $1.5 million. NBC's reportedly threatened to fire Michaels if he didn't somehow manage to turn the fortunes of SNL around, and quickly. And in a Screen Rant article, Sandler admits that he knew higher-ups weren't exactly thrilled with his behavior. Sandler claims that the NBC executives didn't like him or his crew of guys, particularly for some of the distracting antics he would pull behind the scenes to the behest of the writers, says the article. With Michael's position on the line and facing pressure from the executives, he had no choice but to rework the entire show, purging nearly the entire cast. Beyond all his antics, though, there was a deeper problem. Something besides the passive early 90s racism, the casual sexism, the exclusivity of the boys club mentality, and the wrath of executives. Some members of the writing team seem to think that their acting counterparts simply didn't care. They can't even fake forcing themselves to care, says a longtime SNL writer who saddened by the show's decline. When you watch the show on TV, that comes through. It really seems taken with itself. And when it's as bad as it can be and people act like there's nothing wrong, then there's sort of like a fuck you to the audience. In a 2017 Daily Beast article, Sandler revisits he and Farley's departure. "We kind of quit at the same time as being fired. It was the end of the run for us. The fact that me and him got fired, who knows? We were on it for a few years, had our runs, and everything happens for a reason. We kind of understood because we did our thing. It hurt a lot at the time because we were young and didn't know what we were going, but it all worked out." In 2019, Sandler returned to SNL as a host for the first time ever, 24 years since his firing. He brought longtime friend on stage, Chris Rock, who was also fired from the show, to sing about it. It's impossible to simply chalk Sandler's firing/quitting as him simply not being funny enough. This is unequivocally false if all you're measuring is success. Sometimes you bring together a group of talented people, but the talent simply isn't enough. Not when people have checked out, are unable to stand the side of each other, and are fighting with executives anyway. Even if Sandler had behaved like the model actor, he probably still would have been in trouble on the set, considering how toxic the environment was at the time. Chemistry and unity and the foundation of a good ensemble, and perhaps if Sandler had been a part of a different one, things might have been different. Stay up to date with the latest news and comedy by subscribing here to our YouTube channel. Follow Comedy Hype across all social media and look out for original content on our new streaming service at comedyhype.com. For Comedy Hype News, I'm Tamika.